Okay, so today I'm going to talk about the inflation expectations, insights from microdata, and some evidence that we can find in some surveys about inflation expectations of both households and firms. So let's get started. So today I'd like to stress three main points. The first one is that inflation seems to be perceived by the general public as the very bad thing. I mean, not just very extremely bad, but systematically bad in a much broader sense than economists usually understand this. Secondly, I will talk a little bit about inflation expectations and income and wealth inequality. And finally, I will elaborate a little bit about the firm's inflation expectations. So for those of you who were tuned to the most recent Jackson Hole Symposium, uh, just earlier this year, you might remember this graph from the presentation of Yuri Gornichenko from UC Berkeley, which basically shows us this discrepancy between inflation expectations of professional forecasters like guys from investment banks or from academia and the general US households. As we can see here on the graph, on average, uh, people who expect higher inflation usually associate this with slower economic growth, in contrast to the US professional forecasters who see higher inflation as a good sign for the economy, just following the standard Phillips curve idea. So here's the discrepancy. And what I decided to do is to look closer to the data from consumer surveys in US, just to look what's going on with US households, why this discrepancy happens. Here's the chart that shows us how the distribution of 1 year ahead inflation expectations differ across different individuals who expect different economic outcomes in a 1 year ahead period. So here is the distribution of inflation expectations of the people who expect better economy, better economic growth 1 year ahead. Here is the one of the people who expect the economy to stay around the same. And here is the distribution of inflation expectations of individuals who expect the economy to do worse 1 year after than in the moment of the polling. This data comes from Michigan survey of consumers, very famous and important one. Here, what we can see is that even in just generally in distribution, people who expect economy to perform worse in 1 year ahead period also expect, on average, in terms of the mean, higher inflation. And that's kind of a puzzling, yeah, because this contradicts significantly to the standard and conventional logic and theory of the Phillips curve that given that economy is absent of any supply shocks, higher inflation should be associated with better economic prospects. So this is kind of a puzzling finding from the microdata. Yeah, one thing that we can think about from this slide is that, okay, this survey has been started like in 1970s when the US economy experienced the period of stagflation, the period of higher inflation, so-called great inflation period, and some observations from 1970s might skew this distribution toward what we observe. Therefore, like, let's look a little bit how this change in averages has evolved over time. So this bar chart shows us the difference in average expected inflation and its standard deviation across individuals who expect worse and better economies. So basically what I did, I just took the mean from this distribution, subtract from it the mean from that distribution, and these are the blue bars on that chart. What we can see here is that actually this discrepancy, this pattern is quite consistent. It's quite consistent and robust over time. And even during 2000 years of 2000s and 2010s, uh, people who expect worse economic growth expect even more higher inflation than before relative to people who expect better economic growth and lower inflation. So this discrepancy holds over time, and it's quite persistent actually. And again, the orange bars here depict the same idea, the same difference by in standard deviation. So it shows the orange bars show us that on average, people who expect higher who expects worse economy and higher inflation also expect more volatile inflation in comparison to people who expect better economy and lower inflation. So this is kind of an interesting and tricky finding. The same is for unemployment. So people in this survey were asked not only about their expected prospects of the economy, but also about their expectations about where the unemployment can go 1 year ahead from the time when they were surveyed. And this chart mimics the one from 2 slides before, but with respect to inflation. So on the left, here is the distribution of inflation expectations of the guys who expect higher unemployment 1 year after. Here's the one that expect the employment to stay around the same, and the last one is the distribution of expected inflation of the guys who expect less unemployment 1 year after. And again, we can see the same pattern that on average, higher expected inflation is associated with more unemployment, with higher unemployment levels, which which stays quite in line with the with insights from the previous charts. Here are also some interesting correlations of expected inflation with some demographics characteristics. So let's look at the very top table. That table shows us how the average inflation expectations differ across individuals of different marital status, and can divide it by their expectations about the future economy. What we can see here is that on average, usually people who have experienced divorced or who were widowed during their life, they expect on average higher inflation 1 year ahead in comparison with the one who has never been married or are just married or have some constant partner. And again, yes, we see across all these three tables that people who expect worse economy also expect higher inflation. So these finding is actually quite persistent across different demographic groups, which again just strengthens findings or insight from previous charts and bars. Moreover, as we can see from the table, uh, also usually people that have a higher number of children also usually expect higher average inflation in 1 year ahead period. And finally, the people, which is not quite surprising, but still, people with higher education level, with college degree or at least high school degree, expect lower inflation expectation or lower inflation in 1 year ahead period. So their inflation expectations are more anchored in that sense. So what does it might tell us about? We could think about, some personal life experience, or so, about we can think about some personal life experiences, as something that can come or could not come with some stress levels and different stress experience. I think it would be fair to say that people who were divorced or who lost their partner, uh, on average, they have experienced more amount of stress during their lifetimes, as well as people who have higher number of children. Yeah, because I don't have any children personally, but I I could expect that people who've raised a higher amount of children, it was pretty tough challenge for them to handle. So, with this respect, in that sense, inflation expectations of general public might be correlated with different stress levels that particular individuals have experienced during their lifetimes. And in that sense, higher the level of stress, worse the people's expectations about the some economic variables like economic growth or inflation. So therefore, might be I might maybe I'm not sure, but I might suggest that more pessimistic people, because of their personal lifetime background, might associate it with also like bad things in the economy, like higher inflation, lower economic growth, uh, etc. Different kind of things. So what does it tell us all about? Again, as I've said, inflation is perceived as a systematically bad thing. It has been perceived so for a long period of time, not only back in 1970s, but also today and during the current times. And what it might suggest us also is that inflation expectations and general expectations about the economy, there might be correlated or influenced or even influenced by the personal experience of the personal life, personal background, and stressfulness level associated with that. Why do we care about it? Why it is important for us as economists? So if people usually perceive higher inflation as something bad, it might be challenging for policymakers to deliver their task to deliver their tasks in an effective way. There are a lot of suggestions in the literature about so-called forward guidance puzzle, for example. What does it tell us about is that in theory, usually people, because through their expectations, should react quite strongly to some uh, policy or policy interventions, both real, both for just communication, some communications by central banks, for example. But it turned out that it doesn't happen, at least with the if we take as an example the forward guidance policy implemented here in US and all around other advanced economies. So forward guidance actually has a much less significant effect on economic variables than it's supposed to have in theory, and such a bad link in between public's inflation expectations and their expectations about the economy might be the key thing for why this mechanism is kind of broken. Uh, the second thing that is also quite popularly discussed in literature is that, lost or weak Phillips curve relationship. In it, we see that association of higher inflation with worse economic growth violates this idea of Phillips curve completely. And indeed, there were some papers, like one that are mentioned here in the slides, that showed that indeed on micro level data, Phillips curve is quite weak, and its slope is either very small, or if it is significant, or it's not significant at all for last couple of years. That's kind of challenging fact for policymakers generally. What might be the causes of such discrepancy in households' expectations? Well, theory suggests that there might be several explanations, so like deviations from full rationality or some information rigidities. There were enormous number of papers that stressed the fact that information acquisition might be costly, and the true state of the economy might not be well known or even observed by agents and households in particular. And that might cause the problem. It might cause what we've seen just in microdata from consumer surveys, and even empirically, that's theoretically, but even empirically, the hypothesis of full information relation expectations is strongly rejected in the microdata, as some recent papers also found. Let me now talk a little bit about inequality, about income inequality and wealth inequality, and how it is related to inflation expectations. These two tables tell us a story that usually, on average, poorer people also expect higher and more volatile inflation expectations. More volatile inflation, sorry. Both, if we will divide consumers across income quantiles or home value quantiles, wealth quantiles, we see that this pattern is again quite strong and quite persistent. Why is it so, and why it might be important for us? Well, it's important first of all for policymakers' communication policies, how they communicate, and moreover to whom they communicate their policies. From basic theory, we know that from some DSG models with non-Ricardian agents, or so-called hand-to-mouth agents, we know that low-income or liquidity-constrained households have more volatile consumption that also leads to more volatile output and therefore less stable business cycle, which finally the guys like central banks want to smooth. Therefore, if central banks, we as a policymakers, still want to smooth the business cycle effectively, we might think about how to communicate our policy to exactly to these low income and borrowing constrained individuals who might not smooth their consumption well as standard Ricardian agents. So policymakers should take into account and should focus quite a bit on how the inflation expectations of low income groups are formed in reality. However, if we will look some empirical literature, we will see quite quite troubling fact that in reality, in the data, there's not a lot of support for idea that households' expectations respond much to some monetary policy actions or monetary policy announcements, uh, which is quite troubling for policymakers in the Fed, for instance. This might happen. This usually happens with due to several reasons. One of them is that generally households might be unaware about monetary policy decisions and how they're set and how the decisions are made. But there are some papers that suggest the fact that even if households are made aware about the monetary policy and how it is implemented, they just don't have a meaningful clue how these policy actions might finally affect the aggregate stance of the economy, which finally again which finally breaks this link between policy communications, consumers' expectations about the economy, and finally their real economic decisions that policy is aimed to influence. So, moreover, I would say that there's still, very scarce facts about how low income and constrained and liquidity constrained individuals react to different monetary policy interventions. And indeed, it's quite hard to distinguish exactly because of these facts that the general public just in general usually is not aware about monetary policy decisions and do not say does not take them into account. So that's quite a challenge. That's quite a challenge for policymakers that they have to think about a little bit more. Finally, let's look to firms and their inflation expectations. So this is the data from Livingston survey. This is the survey of economists in different sectors, both in academia, in central banks, in just commercial banks, and in other forms of businesses. Here is this sample is limited only to observations from non-financial corporations, non-financial business. And again, we can see the same pattern. Even across the firms, one that expect higher inflation, also associated with slower economic growth, as we can see from this panel. And again, we might suggest that it might be due to these observations from stagflation era. But even if we divide this sample across different time periods, we will see that this pattern is quite persistent over time. Yes, during 1970s, that negative relationship was even stronger due to the period of great inflation. But even in 1980s and in 1990s, even the era of great moderation, even in the era of great moderation onwards, we still see this negative relationship that, again, the same as in case of US households, contradicts the general idea of this Phillips curve relationship. Yeah, the positive relationship between expected inflation and expected economic growth, given the absence of supply shocks or anticipated supply shocks. So it seems like that firms' inflation expectations strongly mimic the pattern from household surveys, and indeed there are some support for this in the literature that households' inflation expectations are strongly linked with the firm's inflation expectations. However, the main problem with firms is that firms' inflation expectations are not studied yet. There are enormous amount of literature, especially due to Yuri Grodnichenko and Olivia Cobillon, about households' inflation expectations, but there is really the literature on firms' inflation expectations is really scarce, and mainly it's all because of the data, the lack of data, the lack of very good samples and panels that assert firms' inflation expectations to firms' individual and specific characteristics like the size, the amount, the level of innovativeness, how firms are innovative or not. There was one attempt, quite recent attempt, to resolve this issue, the issue of the lack of reliable data, again by these guys, Olivier Cobillon and Yuri Gordnichenko. They created a very nice data set that's called New Survey of Firms Expectations, but unfortunately it's not publicly available yet, so you can just go to the website, so some aggregate statistics, but nothing more. However, the one main advantage of this data set is that it provides not only the information about inflation expectations and expectations about other macroeconomic aggregates like in Livingston survey, but also information about firm specific characteristics, like I said, like a size, the amount of workers hired, etc., etc. So this might be very good data to look at as far as you would study the firm's inflation expectations and how they're actually formed in reality. So basically, that's all I wanted to talk about today. Thank you very much for your attention.